Hey y'all, and welcome back to Adventures with Ariel. Remember when Disney was weird? It might be hard to, because nowadays we're spoiled by Disney animation. But once upon a time, in a turbulent decade known as the 2000s, Disney was struggling in the animation department. And they were also producing films that, in retrospect, were really weird. Now, I don't mean to say that they were all bad. Weird can be good, especially when it's a heartwarming film about a little girl from Hawaii and her alien sidekick. But let's be honest, people don't reminisce about Treasure Planet, Atlantis, The Emperor's New Groove, and Dinosaur in the same way that they do about Beauty and the Beast or The Lion King. As for Chicken Little and Home on the Range, well, we like to forget those ever existed. But my question is, after an entire decade of this, how did we get to this? And what exactly was it that made these films box office duds? Keep watching to find out. Now, it's important to note that before the slump, there was a decline. Let me explain. In 1995, Disney released Pocahontas. This was smack dab in the middle of Disney's Renaissance era, an era that is typically considered to be the pinnacle of animation, an era that successfully got Disney out of a dark age of box office duds by revitalizing the Fairytale musical. So given all of their recent success, with films like Aladdin and The Lion King, Pocahontas was also expected to be a massive success, bigger than The Lion King even. But it wasn't. It made even less box office cash than its predecessors, and the second half of the Renaissance would continue to see a decline in box office sales, with reviews ranging from mixed to positive. So why did this happen? Well, many suspect that audiences had grown tired of Disney's tried and true formula. I mean, think about it. After The Little Mermaid, every single film had to have show-stopping song and dance numbers, an obligatory love interest, and of course, cute animal sidekicks. Also, these tropes were put in whether or not they worked within the context of the film. I'm looking at you, Hunchback Gargoyles. Not to mention that while all of this was going on, more competitors were hitting the scene. Disney's partner, Pixar, was putting out films with highly original stories and characters, and a few years later, DreamWorks would follow suit. These were films that challenged the Disney formula and proved that animated films could be successful without a princess or musical number. Audiences were taking notice, and eventually Disney did too. It was time to diverge from the formula and get experimental. At the tail end of 1999, Fantasia 2000 was released, marking the start of the post-Renaissance period. Like the original Fantasia, Fantasia 2000 consists of animated segments set to classical music. It did reasonably well with critics, but was a box office dud. The film made $90 million at the box office, just barely passing its $80 million budget. Funny enough, the original Fantasia had flopped as well, although that one is more fondly remembered, as it didn't have all of those annoying celebrity cameos from the sequel. So next up was Dinosaur, released in the spring of 2000, one of the more unusual Disney films for sure. This was Disney's first computer-generated feature, matching very realistic dinosaurs with live-action backgrounds. Critics described the film's plot as generic and dull, but praised it for its stunning computer animation. You gotta admit, for the year 2000, this looks pretty darn good, and this is likely why Dinosaur still managed to become a box office success. Heck, it ended up being the 5th highest grossing film of that year. But it's funny how the Disney flop of that year would go on to become much more fondly remembered. The Emperor's New Groove was basically Disney's answer to the Looney Tunes. Seriously, you thought Hercules was goofy? Well, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Oh yeah.
Like many of the experimental movies, The Emperor's New Groove would have never been released in Disney's Renaissance, but it's hilarious, extremely quotable, and overall a very memorable film. Upon its release, this film flew right under the radar when it shouldn't have, making only $10 million on its opening weekend and premiering at 4th place behind some strong competition. This would mark the start of a pattern that would, unfortunately, continue for much of the decade. Enter Disney's short-lived sci-fi era, starting with Atlantis in 2001. This was a major departure for Disney in terms of its content, as the film was made with older audiences in mind. Atlantis had extensive world building, its own constructed language, and likely the highest body count of any Disney movie. The mature material is likely what turned families away from Atlantis. And that's too bad, because Atlantis is a really unique Disney film, with an interesting story to boot. 2002 would see the release of 2 Disney films, one of them being Lilo and Stitch. A sci-fi no doubt, but most definitely not a bomb. The opposite in fact. This movie was a wild success, and in my honest opinion, the best movie of the experimental era. It's hard not to like Lilo and Stitch, a film that takes a family-centric story and throws aliens, secret agents, and Elvis Presley into the mix. It doesn't sound like it would work, but it strangely does. Lilo and Stitch is extremely quirky, but also sweet and relatable. The film also had something that a lot of other Disney films didn't at the time: an amazing marketing campaign. If you were alive in the early 2000s, you know what I'm talking about.
Hey, that's not Simba.
Stitch would crash iconic scenes from famous Renaissance movies. This was basically Disney's way of proudly proclaiming, "See? We're not like the old Disney anymore." You have to remember that at this time, Disney animated films were being mocked by the likes of DreamWorks, so this promotional strategy aimed at challenging viewers' expectations towards Disney. It worked because Lilo and Stitch made way more money than any of its predecessors and spawned several sequels. But as big a success as Lilo and Stitch was, it couldn't save Disney's most expensive flop, Treasure Planet. The film was released in November of 2002 and had to compete against Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. That alone was a challenge. But it gets worse. Unlike Lilo and Stitch, the marketing for the film was terrible.
Three unlikely heroes are taking on the meanest cyborg in the universe.
Pirates on my ship. Oh, Mama. Good Mom.
Walt Disney Pictures presents Treasure Planet.
The trailers didn't really tell audiences what the movie was about, but also revealed too much at the same time, including a twist antagonist and a character we don't even see until halfway through the film. It's unfortunate that the film was the colossal flop that it was, given how it had been in production since the 80s and had a massive budget. In conclusion, a lot of money was lost from Treasure Planet, and this was detrimental to the animation studio. Disney thought that 2D animation was the problem. You have to remember that at this time, films like Toy Story 2, Monsters Inc., and Shrek were capturing the critical praise and revenue that Disney was not receiving. So all they had to do was implement CGI into the films and problem solved, right? If only it were that easy. As the two final 2D films completed production, Disney closed both of their 2D animation studios in Burbank and Florida, as well as fired many animators and directors who had been there for over a decade. It was a sad end to an era that should have gone out with a bang, but didn't. 2003's Brother Bear did end up making more money than most of the experimental films, but was critically unsuccessful. And then the next year we got Home on the Range, a film that completely flopped, lost the studio a lot of money, was critically panned, and is also deemed responsible for the death of traditional animation. Yeah, Treasure Planet was a bomb for sure, but at least it was a passion project in the hands of creative animators. Home on the Range was seen by critics as being boring, forgettable fluff. And after seeing the film myself, I have to agree. It's not even that bad, per se, just painfully mediocre. And when it comes to Disney animation, we expect more than mediocre. So before we get to, Chicken Little, let's take a closer look at what was going on behind the scenes. You see, there was a lot of drama happening within the Disney studio at the time, and this is likely another reason that their films had gotten so lazy. For one, there was a lot of tension between Disney and Pixar, as Pixar was threatening to look for other distributors besides Disney for their films. You can learn more about how that happened in my Disney vs. Pixar series. There was also a lot of tension between CEO Michael Eisner and Walt Disney's nephew, Roy E. Disney. Upon announcing his resignation from the company, Roy criticized Eisner for his mismanagement of Disney, citing his neglect of the studio's animation division. He even began a website and campaign that asked those on the board of directors to not vote in favor of re-electing Eisner. Long story short, Disney was experiencing a lot of contention within its walls. But fortunately, this didn't last for long. In 2005, Michael Eisner resigned, and Roy Disney returned to the company. Shortly after, Disney bought Pixar for $7.4 billion, and Pixar founder John Lasseter became the chief creative officer for both Pixar and Walt Disney Animation. The seeds were steadily being planted for Disney's revival era, but the studio's next two films, which had been in production for years, were not going to make anything better. 2005 brought us Chicken Little. It made more money than all of the other films in the experimental era, but was also the most panned film of the era, and is seen by many as being the worst Disney film ever. I personally would give that title to The Black Cauldron, and the only reason I say that is because on top of being a bad film, The Black Cauldron was also boring. Don't get me wrong, Chicken Little is really bad, but it was entertaining at times and got a few chuckles out of me.
I fell out of bed. Huh? How'd you get over there? Over where? There. Where? There. How'd you get over there? Who are we talking about?
That aside, this film has a lot of issues, including outdated pop culture references, unlikable characters, and a mismatched plot involving baseball and aliens. I mean, I think the poster says it all about the quality you can expect from this film. So, 2 years later, audiences would meet the Robinsons. This film got mixed reviews and didn't make much money either, but it was still a huge step up from Chicken Little. For one, the Disney-Pixar merger was completed around the time that this film was finishing production, and one of the first executive decisions was to demand that a third of the movie be rewritten and reanimated. And thank goodness it was, because we could have very likely gotten another Chicken Little. But yeah, the film is charming, imaginative, and a lot funnier than Chicken Little was. Not the most memorable film, but still a fun watch. Disney had fallen so far that just a fun watch was actually a breath of fresh air. And then came Bolt. The 2008 film would give us our first glimpse of what we were to expect from Disney's impending revival era. John Lasseter played a huge part in Bolt's success. Remember, this was the guy who was responsible for these animated classics. So yeah, as I said before, Lasseter became the chief executive officer of Disney Animation, and Bolt was the first movie that he oversaw start to finish. His magic worked, because Bolt was met with an 89% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and $310 million at the box office. The most common complaint I hear about the film nowadays is that it was somewhat forgettable, which I agree with, and I think this is most likely the reason that Bolt is still considered an experimental era film. In fact, Bolt was arguably the last film of the experimental era. I say arguably because for some reason many consider 2009's Princess and the Frog to be the last, and I kinda get where they're coming from because Princess and the Frog made even less than Bolt, but to me and many others, Princess and the Frog is undoubtedly a revival film. Heck, the film re-established the classic animated musical Fairytale that the company is known for, and in the era to come, Disney would produce more and more of these kinds of films. They were all computer generated because this was more cost efficient for the company, but fairy tales nonetheless. In some ways, the experimental era never truly died. Films like Wreck-It Ralph, Big Hero 6, and Zootopia also strayed away from the Disney formula, but they had a lot of elements that many of the experimental films were missing, like an interesting story, great characters, superb animation, and of course, a quality marketing campaign. The revival era, I believe, is particularly special because it's mixed classic fairy tales with engaging original stories. It's the best of both worlds, really. And as for the experimental era, well, I think it deserves more appreciation than it gets. It was hit or miss, but the hits really hit. Does that make any sense? Unfortunately, films like Treasure Planet and Atlantis were released at a particularly turbulent time for the studio. However, they feature the same sweeping moments, charming cast of goofy characters, and gorgeous animation that a lot of the classics do. Most of the experimental films deserve another watch, despite their initial and disappointing releases. So what was your favorite film of the experimental era? Let me know in the comment section below. Also, feel free to share any of your opinions on these movies and their history. I like to keep my videos at a reasonable length, but there is so much more I could have talked about regarding these movies. Like, the history behind Treasure Planet and its failure is worth an entire video. Actually, someone did do a video about it. For a more extensive look at Treasure Planet, I would highly recommend Breadworth's video on the subject right up there. Just click right up there. And if you learned something new today, please give this video a huge thumbs up, as well as hit that subscribe button down below for new Disney content every single week. Alright y'all, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a magical day.